Hey all, we raised $205.91 for the World Food Program for Palestine. I will donate $294.09 myself to bring the total to $500. That is actually kind of sad. Thanks to all who donated. I would also like to announce my retirement from the online politics space. I had a lot of personal life things come up over this last year that have taken part of me with them. Content creation takes up 15 hours of the 20 hours of my week, and as I enter into a new stage of my family life, I think it's best for my family to step back from content creation. What? What? But people do content creation regardless or not whether or not they have a like you can tune down your content creation. Whatever. Interesting. Hey, hello, Stumbling. However, I will have exactly 3, maybe 4 more streams. Tomorrow, I will discuss my positions with a guy named Nevin. Saturday, I'll have my farewell stream, 4 p.m. ET. And Monday, I will be on my final Live and Learn episode. I also have a debate I organized several months ago, scheduled for November, where I will be moderating. If that goes to plan, that will be my final public appearance as Econoboi, barring some special event. Holy shit, did Destiny really fuck him this hard? Dude, I'm a guy. I'm a guy. I'm a guy. I'm a guy.
What? Fuck.
Yo, Glowmite Queen Stumbling. Thank you so much for the 5 gifted. Thank you so much, buddy. You're like one of my favorite viewers, unironically. Thanks for the 5. That's very kind. W Stumbling. Econoboi is not stopping due to debate. No way. Dude, come on, Dev. Dev. Come on. Dev. Dev. Dev, you can't be covering for him like this, okay? Jesus. Come on. We all know what happened, all right? The timing is too fortuitous, okay? Come on. I'll continue to occasionally release an article on my Substack over at Econoboi Substack. No, recent drama had very little to do with this decision. I don't believe him. Though admittedly, the additional stress wasn't great. This was something on my mind for a long time, and I'd like to thank everyone who supported me over the last several years. I've learned a lot on this journey. I hope I taught you something too, and I wish you all the best of luck. P.S. Here's the final donation. Cool. Dude. What happened? There's no shot! There's no shot! What? Dude, did Destiny actually rape him? Oh my god. Dude! Bro. I have insider details. Promise not to tell. Chef Hataku. Sure. Go for it. Go for it. Go for it. I don't know. I think that maybe him coming out socialist was a rage bait arc before leaving social. No, I don't think so. Well, now I can't. You sped. Oh, okay. All right. Well, too bad. So sad. All right. Um. All right. What is this? Econoboi is out. Why would you read out on stream? I'm sorry, Dev. I'm just like making fun of you. So, was this debate like a farewell gift for us? Good for him. Seems like the recent stuff had little to do with it. And he just needs to. Good not to go out on trying to clarify his positions and such, even if I disagree with him. Dude. Okay, we'll see. We'll see what the debate is like, okay? Fine. We'll see what this debate is like. Oh, okay. Maybe this was all planning to get a lot of exposure before he left. Maybe. I honestly don't know. Are you going to watch the Destiny CNN thing? Mm-hmm. We are. Okay, don't repeat the... Oh. Yum. Stop! Don't tell me, Dev. Just don't tell me, okay? Don't tell me. I'm fine without it, okay? I promise. I'm good, actually.
Candidates within the GOP know that, like,
Oh god, who the fuck are these who make lols? Okay.
Or they pay return capital to...
He got slapped by Connor and Destiny. He got slapped by Sitch and Adam. He got slapped by Dev and my Destiny. No, Dev, just don't tell. It's fine, okay? You don't need to tell me everything. I already know too much about this space. Details that I don't need to know, but I feel like I'm cursed to know, okay?
The election was stolen in every state, basically.
Yeah.
But they...
And I think that that's probably not...
dni.gov, it's all right there for anyone to see. And those who go in and read this will see how President...
Phrased as a question, why is this preferable to capitalism? So, I fundamentally...
Bro, stop responding to my DMs like they're in the chat. Sorry, I'm doing it on purpose to piss you off, okay? I want to annoy you on purpose. Yeah.
Now describe myself as a socialist because I came to a developed egalitarian view where egalitarianism is something that I think is intrinsically valuable for a number of reasons. We can relate to each other as equals. I think that's a good thing, morally speaking. I think that the distributional principle of essentially equal access to advantage, where advantage is welfare and resources, established by G.A. Cohen, I think those are sensible egalitarian views as well. And capitalism kind of violates this in a number of ways. It violates it because of the private ownership of the means of production, sort of unequally distributing wealth in society, right? And unequally distributed wealth means unequally distributed capital income.
Okay. Yeah, this is just the typical talking points.
But it also means unequally distributed power in society, right? Wealthy people have a lot more power. They have a lot more, as Ryan Mullally would say, capacity, but I would just say freedom. And I think that that's probably not good, especially on balance of your other values. Essentially, if we can create a more equal society without destroying the economy or, destroying innovation or something like that, then I think that we should do it. And then maybe you'd sacrifice some level of like utility or something for some like radical increase in equality, perhaps. And so I think that that's just something that is important. I think that inequality itself needs a reason to exist, and our current unequal society just doesn't have a good enough reason, if you ask me. Now, to go on to finish out, I'll talk about my model very briefly. I think that the capital allocation, profit motive, like these kind of competitive processes are important. The way that capitalism kind of works today is that we have huge asset managers that allocate a huge proportion of the capital in society.
Oh, dude, this is all stuff from like 2 years ago, right? Fuck, I kind of want to be nicer to Econoboi now, just mainly because now that I know he's technically out of the space. But like, I have like 10 fucking videos lined up for Econoboi, so it's like I'm raping his corpse or some shit. That's what it feels like. So if you guys don't know, I schedule my videos like 10 days ahead of time sometimes, because that's how much content I create. And yeah, so it kind of feels like I'm beating a dead corpse. Or beating a dead horse or something, right? Like, fuck. I feel kind of bad now. He deserves the attention, sure. But like, all these videos are just making fun of him. And being like an unhinged hater. Whatever.
society. And so basically what I'm saying is we should transition that process, that capital management asset process, from private hands to public hands in the form of sovereign wealth funds and holding corporations, to where we can eat up a large chunk of the economy, if not the whole economy, if things just end up working out really, really well by doing this. One small caveat before I give it over to Wick and Destiny is when I reference countries, I've heard people say that I said this. I've never said this, and I won't say it today. I don't think that the Nordic countries are socialist countries, okay? I think that socialism is when you collectively own the means of production. Societies exist on a spectrum between total...
All right, let's speed this up. Tiny Jewish hat. Foreskin missing.
Private ownership and total collective ownership. The socialist ideal, the capitalist ideal. The Nordic economies, the reason I reference them is because they've engaged in a process of socializing at least a very large chunk of their economies. And we can see kind of the fruits of that, where they have reasonably decent levels of economic growth, employment, good unionization, things like that, high equality. And I think that those are just good examples of the process where I want to move society towards.
Okay, well, thanks for being here. Destiny, why is capitalism the superior system to whatever Econoboi just said?
Because capitalism is based. I just want to start off by saying that I spent a lot of time on Amazon because I was going to respond to Econoboi's horrible appropriation of violent communist flags and other stuff in the background. I was going to buy a bunch of Nazi shit, and they don't actually sell Nazi flags on Amazon. So I don't appreciate that. I feel like it's very one-sided in how they run things over there. When it comes to like a larger discussion on this, I don't know if I need to clarify this or not, but I guess just for anybody listening who doesn't catch everything on every platform, obviously there were a lot of heated debates between me and Pisco and Econoboi and other members of different communities having to do with like leftists and tankies and bad actors and everything. Just to clarify for the 50 millionth time, I don't think Econoboi is a secret tanky. I don't think he's secretly trying to be subversive or doing things. I do disagree, I think fundamentally, with a lot of his platform, but not in the same way that I would say that like other like Marxist-Leninists are bad faith actors trying to worm their way into the system to destroy everything in a way that they're not upfront about. Just I guess for anybody that needs to hear that or isn't clear of that. So I guess our conversation will probably revolve around a few things in this debate or conversation, whatever we call this. So I think the first issue I have is I think there's like an unclear vision of what socialism actually is or means. I think it's kind of ironic, or not ironic, but funny, I guess, that Econoboi kind of started off clarifying, what his version of socialism is, that he doesn't think that Nordic countries are socialist. And it seems like that on one hand you want to say, not Econoboi in general, but on one hand like people want to say that they're socialist, but then you fight so much against like what socialism means or what it doesn't mean that the label starts to become meaningless. And I think that the issue is that it allows for a lot of bad faith actors to come in and kind of usurp that label and use it as kind of a disguise or a mask for more insidious views. So that's one reason I don't like the socialist label if what somebody's advocating for is largely liberal or works in a liberal or capitalist framework. I think that there are huge moral and democratic questions about what the expropriation of property ultimately looks like. A lot of the examples I think that Econoboi gives for how we could expropriate property I think are a little bit unsatisfactory. So when we bring up things like civil asset forfeiture or things like eminent domain, like we're not taking these things to socialize them or to make them like a part of a socialist economy. Usually they're done for other reasons, sometimes for punishments for crimes or sometimes for necessary government projects. I don't think that those comparisons are the same as trying to acquire 90 to 100% of the overall capital of the United States, under the ownership of the government. I think that when we talk about egalitarianism and when we talk about idealized forms of economies, I don't know how much time I'll argue this, but I think it's interesting that you always hear this argument, even capitalists give here, socialists will say, and capitalists will say, well, socialism only works in an idealized form of society where there's no human greed. And in an ideal world, maybe we'd be socialist. But I don't actually know why that's true. I feel like people assume that, and it's not necessarily the case. Like I can envision an ideal socialist world where everybody shares in the means of production and we all get the fruits of our own labor and, we all can do that, sure. But I could also conceive of an ideal capitalist world where everybody has really high-paying jobs. They can choose who they want to work for at any point in time and quit and leave. And like I feel like you could have idealized versions of both worlds. It's just difficult because with capitalism, there's a real world implementation of that, and you have to fight on that real world implementation. And then on the socialist version, you have to fight on the kind of like idealized or utopian version. So it's harder to kind of like point out flaws. 4 and 5, I think, for the fourth point, I got socializing profits is a thing that socialists always talk about. Like we want equal ownership in the means of production so that we can all kind of reap the rewards. And I think that's an attractive quality about sharing the ownership of the means of production. But it also means socializing decisions. And I feel like there's not as much time paid to the socializing decisions parts. So for instance, if the government owns 90 to 100% of all the capital in the country, that means that every new business started kind of has to be started by the government. So are we taking votes on that? Are they going to be picking winners and losers? Are they going to decide, whether or not there's an 18 or older ID verification limit on my pornographic consumption, or whether or not League of Legends gets canceled for Dota 2 or whatever else? And then I think that for the final thing, this is kind of a general complaint I've had. When people talk about like, we got these really good things because of socialism in the United States, whether you're talking minimum wage or 40-hour work weeks or whatever else, I think it's important to clarify that all of these things are happening in a liberal system, and there are good things that can happen from lots of different modes of economic production and lots of different countries that can happen in a liberal capitalist system. But if we were to move to a fully socialist system, we could only do the good socialist things. You wouldn't have any of the good capitalist things, and I think that is problematic.
Okay, is that your goal, Econoboi, to move to a entirely socialist system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's moral reasons to think that the socialist ideal of complete social ownership of businesses would be a good thing, right? That, again, if we could, and this is something that I've said before, I think a kind of a typical argument that people will make against socialism is, it looks great on paper, which is to say, like, intuitively, sure, like a totally egalitarian system looks great, but it just doesn't work, right? We just can't make it work for one reason or another. And I would say that, look, I mean, I guess I don't know as we move through the process of like fully socializing the economy, exactly what it would look like when we start to get to 80, 85, 90% of businesses being collectively owned. But I think that there's strong reason to believe that we can at least get a great majority of the way there without these kind of huge deleterious effects on the economy. And at the end of the day, I'm not super stubborn about this. Like if we get
Is Econoboi's last stand? It kind of is, yeah.
to whatever 75%, like we've replaced institutional private investors with institutional public investors, which is to say about 75% of the stock market and all this kind of stuff is owned publicly instead of privately. And all of a sudden, we have this kind of like radically egalitarian system compared to what we had before with similar standards of living. I guess I'm just not so offended by that, right? But in our current system where we have just such a high level of inequality, wealth inequality, income inequality, and what I think to be pretty obvious solution.
I think one thing that people need to define as well is like, is inequality bad in the first place? Like is that inequality bad necessarily? Is inequality necessary? For example, like parents have custody over you; they technically own you, right? You're kind of a slave, low key, to them, right? If anything, but like, is that bad? Like bosses will always be above the workers because they give the commands because they're in a leadership command, and maybe that system is more efficient. Is that necessarily bad? I feel like we have to define like what bad means, right? Or what is intrinsically bad, because it feels as though, and I'm not sure, it feels as though Econoboi is arguing that any kind of inequality is bad, right? This wealth inequality is bad. But no, not necessarily. For example, people under 18 cannot vote. People under 18, they can't... people under 16 in some states, they obviously can't drive, like whatever. Is that inherently bad? They don't have the same rights, right? Is that bad? Is that bad? I don't know. Yeah.
Towards fixing that problem in pretty direct ways. We can look at other examples of countries that have done that. We should certainly do it because I think that most people have at the very least egalitarian instincts, and so we should move toward that direction. Even if once we get there, it's like, oh, we have to kind of make some sticky decisions on the edge. I think that the bigger discussion is, should we move towards that direction, and what does moving towards that direction look like? Because certainly I think that we should, and certainly I think that there's a good way to move towards that direction.
Can I ask a question on this? I'm trying to hone in when you say moral reasons, okay? So my understanding is if you had a fully socialist society where all of the workers are owning all of their means of productions, that would basically do little, if anything, to address overall wealth inequality. No? Wouldn't you still have massive wealth inequality across different firms, even if not within different firms? So for instance, if there was like a cooperatively owned or socialist owned engineering firm, wouldn't all those people make way more money than the cooperatively owned janitorial cleaning services firm?
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's important to maybe take a step back. So there's a lot of different ways to collectively own the means of production. Worker ownership is just one of those ways. Now, I don't really favor a worker ownership model personally. I tend to favor social ownership models through things like expansion of government services, which probably you and I would agree that some government services should be expanded, like public transit, healthcare systems, things like that. And then I think that the bulk of the market economy should be owned by these kind of publicly owned holding corporations and sovereign wealth funds, which compete against each other similar to how current asset managers already do. And that would create a hugely egalitarian distribution because public wealth is sort of necessarily horizontally distributed because the way that wealth is managed is one person, one vote, not necessarily one worker in one cooperative, one vote. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, so then we're saying that the businesses are collectively owned, meaning that so employees could still like quit and go to other jobs or get education and training, go to other jobs. Does this mean that the government then would be basically collecting the excess in worker, like in the value produced by the worker? The government would basically be the stand-in for the capital owner there?
Well, I mean, even Marx in his critique of the Gotha program said that the worker is not entitled to the entire surplus value that they create, that you need money to be set aside for things.
Oh my god, thank god I no longer do these debates. Holy shit, I forgot how cancer, like, all of these fucking debates are. It's just like arguing over fanfic.
Things like administration, welfare payments, and I think he also said, like...
But technically, the crystal gems wouldn't be able to do this, and I guess if the homeworld diamonds, if whatever... Oh, okay.
Essentially capital rotation, like reinvestments in capital, right? And so similarly, right, by having a social ownership model, we're essentially accomplishing all of those goals at once, where the worker is returned a substantial portion of the value that they create, because obviously workers still enjoy the fruits of the government's services and welfare payments and, UBI or whatever we use the capital income for. But it also goes to those other things that Marx identified as important as well, just general welfare payments for people who can't work. I think he identified the elderly and people like that as well. And of course, the government can also make public investments with that money as well.
Okay, so I'm trying to just understand. So like administration fees, I wouldn't consider this like capital owner, right? So when I think of capital, I think of for a business, you're deploying you're deploying your capital and then you're deploying your labor. And then when the labor interacts with the capital, the labor is creating some value. And then when that product is like sold to some consumer, some money goes back to the cost of the business, but there's an excess at the top after administrative fees, after everything else. And that excess at the top would go to the capital investor. And I'm just trying to understand. So in this state, you would have the capital investor, the capital owner. The owner class is just replaced by the state, right?
Yeah, the capital owners would be the public at large, right? So again, I think that Marx, obviously, a lot of in Marx's writings, he's a little bit vague. Obviously, he recommended, at some points in his life, he recommended state ownership, but it seemed like there was a cooperative ownership model maybe in the mature part of his life. At the end of the day, though, I'm just saying that, number one, I don't think that Marx is like a definitive view of what socialism is, but even to the extent that he is, I think that the spirit of this, where the worker receives a great portion of the value that they create, but set aside for the rest of society things like administrative expenses, capital investment, and welfare payments. I think that the spirit of that is accomplished with a social ownership model as well. And of course, to the extent that maybe some Marx historian would just say, no, Econoboi, you're totally wrong and misinterpreting Marx, it's like, well, whatever, my system's much more egalitarian, so that's why I prefer it.
Sure. So I'm not trying to figure out what Marx was for your personal, just so that we can understand, I guess, what I guess you would advocate for, personally. So so then we're saying that okay, so just going back to understand. Well, I don't know if Marx agrees with this. You're replacing the capital owner of the business with the state, essentially, with the government, right?
Yeah, ultimately the state would be the owner of the shares in some complex system, but it's managed through these kind of holding corporations and sovereign wealth funds.
Okay. So the state has ownership, and then the management. Does the state, like, you don't have to be like hyper specific, but I'm trying to understand what the managing structure, I guess, would look like. So it's not the state making the decisions; it's the holding companies, or.
Yeah, so I think that these things should be kind of technocratically managed. You mentioned that people should really focus on that kind of decision-making process, and that was a large part of what the third part of my Substack was about, is like, how do these capital allocation decisions get made, as inspired by this book that I read, The Public Wealth of Nations. And so essentially what I would recommend is that the way that the public should manage its wealth is it should be in these competing holding corporations, which are capitalized initially by the state in one way or another, however the state gets its money to capitalize the funds. These funds would then be managed by professional investment managers, kind of at arm's length from the state. You can think of it sort of like the Federal Reserve, right, where the Federal Reserve is kind of this like quasi-independent private agency type situation, but it's more technocratically managed. Do that same kind of similar structure, but with all these different competing holding corporations that operate independently from each other, but are ultimately owned by the state. And then as they allocate that capital and the returns from that capital kind of trickle up to them, they would dividend out part of that to the state directly, and then they would use part of that to reinvest in other businesses and other entrepreneurial activity, similar to how private asset managers do today.
How are they initially capitalized by the state? Like, how would a state decide, like, oh, like there's 5 firms that do stuff, I guess. Yeah, how does that?
I recommend a path in the same Substack that I referenced. So there's 3 main ways. So number one is the state already owns, unbeknownst to it, a lot of public wealth. Dag Detter in the Public Wealth of Nations book, he estimates that basically because the state just has a really poor system of accounting, the state already owns about 1 times GDP worth of public assets. They just don't account for them properly. And so what a lot of states have done, both in relation to Dag Detter's work, but then in opposite to that, is they've just accounted for their current public assets and spun them off into these holding corporations to be managed entrepreneurially. The state just realizes, oh, we own a lot of real estate. Oh, we have all these SOEs that we don't really account for properly. We have all these kind of like state, kind of quasi-state service companies that we run. Let's put those into a commercial bucket, holding corporation. Professional investment managers allocate that capital, run it professionally.
So the state owns all the wealth, which is then redistributed into innovative enterprises. Is that what he's saying? Like the overall state owns like a bunch of wealth. Okay, all right, I don't know.
So that's one way.
Wait, first thing, having wealth. So wealth, broadly speaking, can include things like capital. You can invest like capital. We're not talking money. Like, just because you might have like a state ownership of a bunch of utility companies or power plants, doesn't mean you can just invest that, because that's represented by like physical capital, not like just money, right?
Yeah, it's a mixture of things, right? So it's physical capital. The public at large, the most poorly accounted for assets in a public portfolio are typically real estate assets. Municipal buildings, rights of way, public lands, things like that. And so what you would do is you put all that capital into a single portfolio. This would be worth about $29 trillion. Some of those assets, like you said, wouldn't be commercial. They'd be like state parks or municipal buildings that are currently in use. It's like, well, we're not.
Wait, but then you wouldn't have the advantages of the free market, right? Wouldn't you? Because in terms of the market, I think I remembered that because the market gets to regulate prices. So is it the state that's regulating prices?
Not going to like use these for a for-profit purpose. But for all those assets that we now discover and that we would want to put.
Oh, hello. Is this me or him?
$15 or $14.5 trillion, then you could take all of that. Oh, Wick, is everything okay?
You're good.
Oh yeah, you froze for a minute. And we were
Okay.
State owns business capital.
You can take all of those real estate assets and then say, okay, well, let's just start developing them, right? And so part of that could be real estate development. It could be selling that off and investing in equities, just kind of generally building the wealth of society. That's just one way.
Oh, wait, hold on. I'm just trying to understand this for the first thing. I'm super confused. Okay, so it sounded like we were saying. So I'm trying to figure out like how do you capitalize these initial public holding corporations? So like, where do they get their money from initially? And then it sounded like the answer was, well, there's actually a whole bunch of wealth that exists in the United States that's actually not accounted for right now, which I agree is actually a weird problem. We talk about GDP, but we don't actually know the nation's wealth. Like what is the total public accounting of all the assets. And then you say, well, there's a lot of these things that exist out there that aren't accounted for very well, and so we can have a better accounting of them. It's like, okay, but when we have that better accounting of them, we're not talking about money sitting in bank accounts. We're talking about we're like the stuff that capital is allocated to that it buys. So like power plants or real estate or
Just
whatever.
to simply answer your question,
Yeah.
they would be sold for money or they would be developed directly.
How would they
right?
sell
So
it?
you
But
have
if we're talking about a model where we're moving to public ownership of all these things, who are you selling it to?
Well, I mean, you have to transition from one system to another through some deliberative process, right? So currently they would be sold to like a bunch of different, whatever, private investors or other like state investors who would want to invest in those. Like, oh, we want to buy this real estate, we'll exchange it for cash. And then the holding corporation can take that cash and then do other development activities, invested in public equities, just do entrepreneurial investing and, balance sheet management, just like any of these other asset managers do. And then through that process, they would accumulate capital.
The examples that we're giving here.
Why the fuck would you need to do this? Why? What's the advantages of this?
Can you give me a couple examples of things that you would? That seems like a horrible idea. Hold on, I'm sorry. I'm thinking like the things that the public owns. Like, are we selling national parks for cash to capitalize our new public holding firms? Or are we selling like Section 8 housing? Or are we selling like power plants?
No, I just said there are going to be some assets that are not commercial in nature. I even referenced national parks. Like you probably wouldn't, you wouldn't sell a national park for cash. But there's a lot of land or abandoned buildings that the government owns that it doesn't use.
To make it socialism and support social programs. Sure. But then you would lose out on a lot of benefits of capitalism, right? Like starting up, like giving people the means to start up their own personal businesses. That's one, right? You would need to get approval from the state, which you would have to like dig through bureaucratic slog, right? Essentially, instead of like just starting instantly. I don't know, like there just seems to be so many like. Just why? There's no reason to do any of it because capitalism does all of this already.
Used productively because the government just has a very poor system of accounting for those assets, right? And so to the extent that we have assets like that we think like, we're not using this basically for any productive purpose, we can either lease those out for development directly to strip back cash from the market and use for other entrepreneurial activities, or we could, which is to say directly develop them, or we could just sell those for cash and then use the cash, these kind of socialized rents, for other entrepreneurial activity, investing in equities, private equity invest, whatever it ends up being. And through that process, the state now.
Who's define capitalism? Yeah, an economic system primarily focused around the free market, and in which the free market is, in a way, whether it is regulated or not, prices are determined primarily by supply and demand and other factors. And very vaguely, it's based on trade, but yeah.
Was either developing assets directly or it transfers assets for cash and uses the cash for development activities.
Okay, I understand the answer. I think it's very unsatisfactory, but okay, I got part one, and then you had two more other points. Yeah.
Right. So the other two ways that the state could capitalize these funds, number one is just through efficient tax revenue, right? So you just take tax money and capitalize funds. Oh, this we're gonna dedicate a certain amount of tax revenue to a sovereign wealth fund every year, and then once the sovereign wealth fund accumulates enough capital, we're gonna split it off into these different holding corporations. You could certainly do it that way. Another way, that the last thing that I'll say, which I think is kind of a an interesting way to think about, that Bank of Japan does something a little bit similar, is that the Federal Reserve engages in quantitative easing, where the Federal Reserve creates money and then transfers the cash that they created with financial assets. But our Federal Reserve has the restriction where they only use that cash to buy fixed income. They don't buy equities with that. And so what we could do is engage in the same countercyclical policy that we already engage in, and instead of just buying debt instruments, we could buy equities as well. And through that process, we could accumulate capital and then transfer that capital into a sovereign wealth fund, and then eventually split it off into competing holding corporations once the sovereign wealth fund gets big enough.
Okay, and then
that way.
So I understand so we have a couple of ways that we would get the money there. How do you make the decision of like how many of these holding companies will you have, and who gets how do you do that part?
Yeah, I think in terms of the decision making on how you would do it, I think you would want to have as rules-based a system as possible. Currently, I don't know that I would have any strict upper limits on how big a holding corporation could be. I think that once you would say oh, the sovereign wealth fund accumulated $15 trillion and we're going to spin it off into 15 different $1 trillion holding corporations as an initial portfolio, you could do something like that. But I think that it's important to note that
wait, so you got every part of this worked out?
Currently, asset allocation is highly concentrated. I mean, I think the top two asset managers in the country control something like $15 or $20 trillion worth of wealth just in and of themselves. And so the holding corporations that do the best are going to accumulate the most capital and make the most returns.
These are assets under management. They're not assets controlled directly by the holding companies. Number one, which I think is significantly different because individuals still have the ability to allocate their portfolios the way that they see fit. And then two, these people, the assets under management, these large firms are not owning the things wholesale that they are managing assets for, right? It's not like BlackRock or any of these huge assets under management firms are making decisions for all of these companies unilaterally, kind of like our public holding corporations would be. So I feel like these are meaningfully different in those two ways.
It's not meaningfully different. What I advocate for is a couple of different structures. So on the first point of
wait, real quick, just in terms of the meaningfully different, it's different to say that somebody has 10% ownership of a stock in a company versus somebody has a controlling share that's making all the decisions for the company, right?
Right, but I don't necessarily advocate for holding corporations always buying controlling interest in companies, right? That's what I was going to explain. So,
Okay.
So these holding corporations, again, my goal is that these holding corporations would have similar mandates to current asset managers, which is to say that they would have, some basic kind of return threshold. They would need to actively manage the funds, and that once they distribute those funds, they need to balance it on a risk-adjusted basis. They need to have like essentially a risk-weighted portfolio, which means that typically speaking, you wouldn't just go out and buy like a majority of Amazon stock. You might buy 2% of Amazon stock and 1% of Apple and 1% of Walmart. You'd have a highly distributed portfolio of assets, and maybe you do a little bit of private equity investing or venture capital on the side.
I feel like
the first point that you made.
I just want to be careful because
you made one extra point. Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Destiny, please.
Okay, so that we stay kind of in one area, because there are things that I think would be super based, like having some kind of basically a public dividend for large companies in the United States that is returned to like every American citizen. I think is an amazing idea because it gives all of us a feeling of accomplishment and investment and like return when our companies do well. Like if Facebook or Amazon or somebody posts huge earnings, the average American doesn't give a fuck unless you have stock in it, right? And I think having some ownership there is great. But we're not talking about just these funds that are broadly diversified and invested in the economy, because this just sounds like kind of an extravagant like IRA or 401k basically. And I think that's meaningfully different than I think we were kind of talking about like controlling shares for these companies, no?
Well, it's so the controlling shares would be that the public would own the holding corporation, right? But we're talking about the holding corporations, which would independently manage the accumulated wealth of the public. So it's a matter of like, what do the holding corporations actually own? And so let's just imagine we get to like my ideal end state. We've got like 100 different of these holding corporations, right? And they've kind of like eaten up. BlackRock is literally like a publicly owned company at this point, right?
Sure,
They've kind of eaten up all of those other.
Well, BlackRock is not even close to publicly owned, right? But hold on, when we say
BlackRock is publicly owned, but it's a publicly traded company. I'm just using that as a.
Oh, you were saying if they were public. I understand. Yeah. Okay. When we say holding corporations, what I'm trying to figure out is like, how did these get created? Like, let's say that there are two holding corporations in my state, and one is called like Green Energy Forever, and the other one is called like veganism rules. And I really want to invest in companies. I would prefer my money would go to the coal-fired dog-eating factory people or whatever, right? How does like a new holding corporation get created that would allocate money in a way that I would want to see my public money go towards? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, how do you create those new holding corporations? You've talked about how you would capitalize them.
Yeah.
Okay, so who would decide how to make them? Yeah.
Well, in terms of who would decide how to make them, like I said, I think that would be a rules-based process. You'd probably have some kind of superstructure for, some basic rules that you would establish for managing the whole portfolio of holding corporations, where they would decide, okay, like what are the basic guidances we want to give to these holding corporations? What are the kind of like transparency requirements that we would have? And then similar to your point, like, okay, well, this is how we would determine when.
This just sounds like capitalism with extra steps. You can have all of these in capitalism and still have like services like USPS and public health care and all of that stuff. You don't need to go this far. No?
To spin off new holding corporations with the accumulations from either tax revenue, other public assets, or the sovereign wealth fund, right? So
the only reason I'm focusing on this part so hard is because, in my opinion, one of the best advantages of capitalism, if you want to be a capitalist cuck, which I am, is that capital can respond efficiently and quickly and robustly to huge economic problems. I think when people argue, there was some paper, I think it was on working on NBER or whatever, that said like no liberal economy in the history of the planet has had a massive famine or whatever. And I think part of the argument was that not only is the media able to report on things quickly, but capital can shift very quickly around to different sections of the economy to respond and adapt to different things. So one of the advantages of capital is that people can identify market signals, put money in an area, and invest in something, and then do whatever they want there. But when we talk about these holding corporations, we're talking about removing that decision-making apparatus and somehow making it a government thing. And I'm trying to figure out like how are these things made? And if to gloss over this and then to move on to the rest of the stuff, this is like the hard stuff that I would argue that if capitalism does anything well, it's allocating capital. Yeah.
Well, right. So there's a number of ways where I think that concern is kind of misplaced. So number one, if we look at how capital is actually invested in current society, there's a lot of papers on this, is most kind of liquid capital that's invested is passively invested, right? It's like people that aren't even making any sort of an active decision with how they're investing their capital, right? So in some sense, you could say by transitioning a great bulk of that market, if we just were to like neutrally buy assets, so for every one asset that we buy that's actively managed, another one's passively managed. And economists have said that this passive investment is kind of a problem for the allocated process. We're kind of transitioning to a more actively managed market in the first place.
Wait, can I try? I don't know if I agree with that. That most capital that is allocated today is allocated passively?
The liquid capital, right? So these are most of the assets that are managed by these institutional investors, like the overwhelming portfolio.
What do we mean when we say passively managed?
So when you you know what passive management is, right? So like passive management is when you would just invest money that essentially just tracks an index on behalf of, it's essentially managed by the asset holding corporation, right? It's not really something that you're going out and sort of trying to find, the actual good investments out there. You're just kind of free riding off of all of the other allocations that are happening actively.
Sure. So I feel like we can call it passive management, but isn't that kind of like one layer removed? Because the funds that you're tracking are index funds that are kind of being managed by people that are, trying to pick like a good assortment of funds within a particular index, and then the index itself can change based on market capitalization of companies. And it is like passively managed in the same way that like if I give money to an ice cream maker, I'm like passively giving that money, I'm not actually making my ice cream, but a guy that's getting the money is actively making the ice cream, right?
Well, there's a lot of papers on how this is like an allocative distortion, right? Because when you essentially it makes it to where there's not as much actual entrepreneurial investing activity, and you're increasing the risk of improper allocation of capital because you're sort of necessarily lowering the amount of actual active investing that people are doing when they're going out and trying to search for the best investments. And so the holding corporations, by engaging in an active management process, are kind of effectively solving that problem by some great proportion, and ideally leading to better allocative efficiency. Because again, I do advocate for very strict technocratic management of these assets. in general.
Sure,
and
I
so to your
understand.
point, just the last thing, just
Sure.
one more thing. The last thing that I haven't been able to say is that you keep on saying that the decision-making process of capital moving in certain places when they see market activity, again, like that whole competitive process between these asset managers is still internalized into my system. That these big asset managers that are now publicly owned would have the same competitive dynamics and incentives to do the exact same thing under my system as they do under our current system. They'd have the profit motive, market dynamics.
Well, that's the
liquid
thing that I don't
markets.
understand. That's why I keep asking how these are created, because I don't think they would have that same. I don't know how they would have that same incentive. Like if there are 5 holding corporations, I still don't know how you pick 5 or how 5 are created. So if one underperforms, do you eliminate it and now there are 4, or do you spin up a new one? Or
Yeah, Destiny, I feel like I've already answered this. So
wait,
okay, so
let me answer this very clearly. Okay, I'm sorry, hold on, because I feel like you haven't answered this at all, and it keeps getting spoke around. I don't know if it's intentional. Okay, all right. So let's say that we are we are restructuring our economy in a way that we want to have these public holding corporations.
You know what's funny is that you can, like, for any of these things where, decisions are being made by the state, you can just like vaguely gesture at, well, we would have a general council in which everyone would vote on what decisions we would need to make that is best for the economy. Like, you can just like vaguely gesture, and saying that does most of the heavy lifting, right? Because you're basically saying, well, here's this magical council that somehow makes all the correct decisions for the rest of mankind in their respective nation.